Today on Trad Takes, we play exclusive never-before-heard audio from a liberal screamfest, and we tackle a listener's difficult question: why and how has God not intervened in our evil world? All this and so much more in this inaugural episode of Trad Takes. Welcome to Trad Takes, hosted by the Traditionalists. I'm your host, Eric Kosovich, and this is episode 1 of Trad Takes. Thank you for joining me this week. If you like what you hear, please like and share, and even if you don't, consider subscribing to the Traditionalists. As you likely already know, there are many other hosts and shows, and even if Trad Takes is not your cup of tea, I hope you'll find something that's up your alley on the Traditionalists. We'll get started as I plan to every week by reading and discussing a comment or comments from the previous video. The one I picked this week is from August 84118. I picked it not just because it's an interesting comment, but also because it's fairly long and must have taken some time and thought. So it deserves a response for that reason alone. August 84118 says, after watching today's episode of Fridays with Father Timothy Geckel, a comment from Kevin resonated with me, as I have thought of this frequently myself. Kevin's comment was along the lines of, why are we still here? I wonder that question all the time. Given the level of human depravity, the political corruption, and the hatred and destruction of Christianity, why are we still here? I am 62 years old, and just when I think I have witnessed the worst of humanity, I am never disappointed by the next level of depravity or sheer evil that exhibits itself in our current world. Sodom and Gomorrah pale in comparison to our world today, given the internet, for example. Current governments commit unspeakable genocides without hesitation or repercussion, and no one reports on any of this, and it is continuously hidden, and many voices that attempt to bring forth the truth are silenced. Thank you, August. A lot to unpack here. If I may be allowed to summarize, your comment is along the lines of, our world is so bad and so evil, why has God not intervened? Now, I'm certainly not able to fully answer this question myself. I mean, no one but God is, really. But I'll give my 2 cents. First off, the question is effectively the same question asked and answered in the book of Job. I'm sure most, if not all, listeners know the story of Job, but at a high level, he's a good man. All these terrible things happen to him, no end in sight, no apparent reason for his continued suffering. But in the climax of the book, God himself speaks and basically answers the question of suffering and of evil. This is in chapters 38 through 41. For my money, probably the most beautiful part of the Old Testament. That's, again, just my opinion, but I won't read them all. I highly suggest that if you get a chance, open your nearest Bible and read those chapters, but I'm going to read a few of them to just kind of give you a taste. So God says, gird up thy loins like a man. I will ask thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Upon what are its bases grounded? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? Hast thou entered into the depths of the sea, and walked in the lowest parts of the deep? Have the gates of death been opened to thee, and hast thou seen the darksome doors? Hast thou considered the breadth of the earth? Tell me if thou knowest all things. So this discourse goes on, and it's very beautiful, very beautifully written. The answer, maybe not satisfying to us, although it should be, is God is God. He knows all, he's all-powerful, he knows best. And what God is saying to Job and his friends is basically, why do we try to understand his ways, and not just humbly submit and confidently believe that he allows the world to be this way? Maybe not satisfying for us, Maybe it's the stoic in me that likes this type of thing, but, that's certainly an answer. The world is in bad shape now. I think anyone who has a traditionalist mindset can agree with that. But do we know better than God? So that's the biblical answer. Building on that, my second point would be this. We know through the church that whatever evil God allows, he allows it for the greater good. If we look at it as a balancing scale, the evil will not and cannot ever outweigh the good in God's eyes. If it did, he wouldn't allow it. And so that's an incredible thing when you think about it. The evil of abortion, the horrors of war, the sin proudly celebrated that would put Sodom and Gomorrah to shame. The good in the world somehow, in God's estimation, is greater. Now, we don't understand that calculation, but we can take some guesses. For example, something on the good end of that scale is, we who are holding true to the true Catholic faith, regardless of the state of the church. That's a big factor in the balance. Maybe a priest driving for 20 hours every week to bring the Mass and sacraments to a handful of people weighs on that. Maybe parents accepting as many children as God gives them, when the world, socially and economically, is set up for 2 incomes with 2 kids. Single people maintaining the chastity of their state in life because the pool of acceptable marriage partners is so small. Maybe we underestimate how pleasing all these are to God, and how much these little things outweigh the great evils on his scale in his eyes. And shouldn't that give us hope and confidence? So in short, my answer to your comment, yes, the world is bad, but God's in charge. We should trust that he knows best. All we have to do is do our best to counteract the evil however we can. And that always starts, and usually will stop, with us and the little simple things we do for love of him. All right, well, this was not how I wanted or was intending to start the first podcast. I'm not planning on preaching or going too far into doctrine and stuff, but this was obviously meant to be. I think it lays the groundwork for Trad Takes and how I see the world. You can call it optimistic, you can call it white-pilled, whatever you want to call it. I do think it's the most sane way to evaluate the world, and it's the way that I see the world. So you may hear in my commentary as I talk about news, which is going to be the general thing we talk about, you may hear that point of view. Thanks for the comment, August 84118. For everyone listening, we'll read and address another comment or two next week. But now, on to the news. All right, so to kick it off, this story is almost 2 months old, but the title of the headline is that women engage in mass primal scream in wake of Trump victory. This was an event in Wisconsin that took place at Clode Park in Whitefish Bay on November 9th. The intent here was for these women who were not happy with the way that the 2024 election turned out to engage in a primal scream in order to release their pain and frustration after the election. So this is obviously a very useful and productive way for these women to protest the election that didn't go their way, thankfully. But Trad Takes actually has never before heard audio of this event. This was recorded with my personal cell phone. So if the quality isn't up to par, I apologize. But let's go ahead and play that now. There you go. Very intimidating, very, very effective method of protest. In all seriousness, This is something that we saw in 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump. We had screaming sessions where people were yelling at the moon, screaming at the moon, cursing the earth that they are on because their candidate did not win. My take on this is that the political culture nowadays has taken the place of something that has been lost in the religious culture. I think we see this on the right as well as on the left, but it seems more pronounced in the left, where they have these articles of faith that they have to believe to be on their side. The faith it takes to believe in things like man-made global warming with certainty, or that life does not begin at conception when all science points that life does begin at conception. Right? You have the articles of faith, you have the leaders who are blindly followed, you have this type of thing, where your world is so turned upside down by a loss of an election that you have no better response than a primal scream. But that's the only thing that will satisfy you emotionally. Allow me to make a suggestion to the Democrat Party. How about instead of screaming, maybe take a step back and look at why you lost? Not because America is racist or bigoted. How about looking at the fact that 75 million people, 75 million voters, dislike your political platform and the belief system that your party proposed? How about you look at the candidates you put up? Kamala, Tim Walz, these annoying, empty, milquetoast candidates. Maybe try for someone a little bit more American next time. Now, I'm not the only pundit making these suggestions, but I guarantee you that the Democrats, the left, won't listen. And you know what? That's fine with me. I mean, with the choices that we've had these last few election cycles, I truly think that the party with the fewest amount of major issues is probably going to win each cycle. The Republicans have a lot of issues, and I won't shy away from that, but so long as the Dems keep their heads buried in the sand and keep in their Marxist echo chambers, they're going to continue to be the worst party and continue to lose elections. And that is fine by me. All right, so this next one I wanted to share with you. Happy Feast of the Epiphany, by the way. And because it is the Feast of the Epiphany, we are still technically in Christmas season, so I can share this Christmas post that a nativity scene was displayed for the first time ever at the U.S. Capitol this year. I guess this past year, at the end of 2024. For all of you who are concerned that the world is only sliding in a negative direction, here is a good example of the opposite. For the first time in our country's almost 250 years of existence, this past Christmas we had a nativity scene displayed. So that's very cool. The guy behind it is not a Catholic. His name is, let me find it, Reverend Patrick J. Mahoney. He is a Protestant. He's apparently a reverend, whatever that means, of the Reformed Presbyterian Church. So not Catholic, but I will still give him kudos for getting this done. I will read from the press release here. For the first time in history, a nativity scene was displayed on the steps of the U.S. Capitol Tuesday, marking what organizers say is a milestone for religious freedom and the First Amendment. The display, accompanied by prayer, Christmas carols, and a reading of the Christmas story, was made possible by a landmark federal court decision that granted Reverend Patrick Mahoney and his supporters the right to peacefully celebrate the Christmas season on Capitol grounds. So yeah, it's kind of a neat thing. It's not a game changer, especially since, the people behind it are not members of the true faith, but it is still something that we can be proud of as Americans. And like I said, a step in the right direction. Pretty cool. Now, what's not pretty cool is abortion. And apparently, the Society of Radiologists in Ultrasound is trying to change the lexicon for radiologists to make embryos seem less human. Now, obviously, changing words and the meaning of words is not something that is new. This is something that was most famously written about by George Orwell in his book 1984, the term being newspeak. An example of this type of newspeak is something that happened at the pinnacle of the wokeness a couple years ago, when they tried to change the name of mother to birthing person. I think we all probably remember that. Of course, it didn't catch on, but the intent of doing something like that and changing the term from mother to birthing person obviously is meant to take motherhood off of the pedestal, which our society and societies throughout all of human history have had motherhood on. So it really comes as no surprise that the Society of Radiologists in Ultrasound, which is probably filled with many people who are pro-abortion, would want to change the terms in their profession to dehumanize unborn babies that are still in their mother's womb. I actually have the report pulled up here, and so I'm going to scroll to the table where they have a list of words that they do not want used. Now, some of these words I don't really care about because I would not know what they are in the first place, but the ones that stick out to me: heart is not supposed to be used. Live is not supposed to be used, nor is living. Viable is on the no-no list. And there's a comments section on the table where it says, quote, avoid all phrases containing heart. For example, heart motion, heartbeat, heart tones, etc. And live, living, and viable in the first trimester. End quote. Very interesting that they keep it to only the first trimester. There's another section here where it goes into a little bit more detail on why. The terms live, living, and viable have been used frequently to refer to any pregnancy with cardiac activity. We recommend against the use of all of these terms in the first trimester. Live and living are best avoided because those terms may be appropriated by people outside of the field of medicine to support political rhetoric and prescriptive legislation. Super interesting. That's basically they're saying the reason we want these terms not to be used is because the pro-life people will use them against us and against abortion. As despicable as this report is, at least they're being honest about their intent. Here's another good quote. An ultrasound examination in the first trimester should be called first trimester ultrasound or early pregnancy ultrasound and not a viability scan. Because the word viability implies that what you're scanning is actually alive. So yeah, usually I try to give people the benefit of the doubt or find a silver lining in something, but I don't think I can find one in this report. It's a fairly clear-cut case of the Society of Radiologists in Ultrasound updating their lexicon, changing their language and their words to defend baby murder. Let's hope that these changes don't stick, just like birthing person didn't stick. And let's hope that the many good people who work in radiology and ultrasound don't take the advice of this report. And we, the terrible pro-lifers who want to defend unborn life, can continue to use words like heartbeat and life when talking about unborn babies. While we're on the topic of abortion and when human life begins, I wanted to also share this study I found. I only have the abstract because I would have to pay to get the whole article. But I did want to read this abstract. This is from Stephen Andrew Jacobs, and it is a 2021 article. The short version, or the shorter version of the abstract, I suppose, is that a vast majority of biologists agree with the Catholic Church that life, human life, begins at conception. It's called the fertilization view in this abstract. Anyway, here's the abstract. Peer-reviewed journals in the biological and life sciences literature have published articles that represent the biological view that a human's life begins at fertilization. The fertilization view. As those statements are typically offered without explanation or citation, the fertilization view seems to be uncontested by the editors, reviewers, and authors who contribute to scientific journals. However, Americans are split on whether the fertilization view is a philosophical or religious belief, 45%, or a biological and scientific fact, 46%. And only 38% of Americans view fertilization as the starting point of a human's life. In the two studies that explored experts' views on the matter, the fertilization view was the most popular perspective held by public health and IVF professionals. Since a recent study suggested that 80% of Americans view biologists as the group most qualified to determine when a human's life begins, experts in biology were surveyed to provide a new perspective to the literature on experts' views in this matter. This is the interesting part. Biologists from 1,058 academic institutions around the world assessed survey items on when a human's life begins, and overall, 96%, 5,337 out of 5,577, affirmed the fertilization view. The founding principles of the field science communication suggests that scientists have an ethical and professional obligation to inform Americans, as well as people around the world, about scientific developments, so members of the public can be empowered to make life decisions that are consistent with the best information available. Given that perspective, and a recent study's finding that a majority of Americans believe they deserve to know when a human's life begins in order to make informed reproductive decisions, science communicators should work to increase the level of science awareness on the fertilization view, as it stands alone as the leading biological perspective on when a human's life begins. So that's the abstract. The short version is that the vast majority of scientists, including people who work in vitro fertilization, IVF, believe that the human life begins at conception. That's not a religious view. That's not a philosophical view. That's a scientific view. And what blows my mind is that if 96% of scientists, biologists, believe that human life begins at conception, how do only 38% of Americans, like the American public, believe that? Can you imagine any other scientific consensus that wouldn't be pushed down to the public? I mean, we're told something like 95% of scientists believe that, man-made global warming is real. There are problems with that number and problems with that study. Maybe that's a topic for another podcast. But boy, we never hear the end of that one, the scientific consensus there. Why don't we hear about the scientific consensus that human life begins at conception? Well, we know why. But yeah, I did want to share that study. I don't know if it makes me optimistic, but it's very interesting to know that a vast majority of biologists agree with the Catholic Church that life begins at conception. Not because the Catholic Church, doctrinally states that life begins at conception, but because they've found that out through their own scientific methods. So that's cool. And it's reaffirming to know, as all true and good science does, it ends up aligning with the Church. All right, I have time for one last item here. Let's do one that might be a little political or controversial in nature. RFK. I hear a lot of people in the traditional circles praising RFK, happy that he's on Trump's team, happy that he's going to be in Trump's cabinet, happy that he's going to make America healthy again. So I don't understand the love for him in traditional circles. I know that many would disagree with me. They think he's awesome and going to do great things. But I just wanted to do a little bit of a reality check here. Let's start with his personal life. Before his first wife killed herself in 2012, probably killed herself because of what I'm about to talk about in 2012, he was keeping more than 24 relationships outside of his marriage. He would keep his conquests in a journal, which his first wife found and is presumed to be one of the reasons that she offed herself. Now, you can argue that this was a long time ago, that he's a reformed man. But then I would point out that in September of 2024, he had a scandal where he was exchanging messages with a reporter. That reporter lost her job because of it, but it sure doesn't seem to be sticking to RFK. It doesn't end at just extramarital affairs. He was arrested for heroin possession after using it for a decade and a half. He claims that it made him a better student. That's definitely something I want the guy who's in charge of making America healthy again to think about heroin. So this is his personal life. I know you can make the argument most politicians have issues like these, and he's no different. At least he has good political views. Well, let's get into those. Let's start with a theme of this podcast, which has been abortion. His website currently reads, let me actually read this from his website. Mr. Kennedy is a firm supporter of the principles laid out 50 years ago in Roe v. Wade. For constitutional and moral reasons, he believes the decision on whether to continue a pregnancy should be up to the mother. Roe v. Wade served this country well for 50 years. Mr. Kennedy supports the judicial principles behind it. If the courts do not overturn Dobbs v. Jackson and restore abortion rights, he will support legislation to accomplish the same. Man, this guy sounds like a hero of traditionalists everywhere. Let's move on to authoritarianism. He once argued that climate deniers should be executed. Don't believe me? Here is a quote from an interview he gave. Quote, I do, however, believe that corporations which deliberately, purposefully, maliciously, and systematically sponsor climate lies should be given the death penalty. Now, he later walked that back, but call me crazy, but I don't trust his walk back, nor do I trust a guy who would think that in the first place, especially when it's a pattern. So in 2009, he endorsed a sentiment that hog farmers are a greater threat to Americans than Osama bin Laden, on the theory that manure and other products associated with large livestock producers emit toxic wastes that threaten the environment. So I could keep going, but it's getting depressing, so I will not even mention his belief in single-payer healthcare and other such crazy ideas. My feedback, I suppose, for listeners and traditionalists in general is before we start putting people up on a pedestal because they agree with us on one or two things here or there, or before we start singing the praises of someone just because they are counter-establishment, whatever that means in this case for a Kennedy, let's take a little chill pill, a little step back, and see the big picture here. If I were in the Senate, I would absolutely vote against RFK's nomination to Director of Health and Human Services. And in the off chance that President-elect Trump is listening, I would suggest that you remove him from your cabinet before the confirmation hearings even begin. That sound means we're all out of time for today. Thank you for listening to this first episode of Trad Takes. Please like, share, and subscribe to The Traditionalists and spread the word. whether for my show Trad Takes or for any of the other shows that are hosted by the Traditionalists. This is Eric signing off. Blessed feast of the Epiphany to you all, and may God bless these United States of America.